Whilst under the 15th Amendment, signed in 1870, all men, and eventually women from 1920 onwards, were guaranteed the right to vote in the United States, this was not the reality for black Americans across the country, especially in the southern United States. Voter suppression tactics, most notoriously the poll tax and literacy tests, were used to suppress the black vote. As quoted from National Geographic, by 1940, the percentage of African American eligible voters registered in the South was only 3%. As evidence of this decline during Reconstruction, the percentage of African American voting age men registered to vote was more than 90%. In this video, we'll try to look at the experience of a black voter in the southern United States to look at the difficulties faced in the attempt to vote. Before our voter goes to the polls, however, we are already, in a sense, defranchised. For 1. Many blacks were not registered to vote in the first place. According to Racial and Ethnic Tensions in the American Communities, Poverty, Inequality, and Discrimination, Volume 7, the Delta, Mississippi Data Report, in Mississippi, only 6.7% of eligible blacks were registered to vote in 1964. Furthermore, Democratic primaries, the party switch happened in the 1920s and 70s, by the way, typically determined who would win an election. These were strictly all white. Nonetheless, our voter persists. As a voter walks down the street towards the voting station, there's a congregation of white voters around the building, glaring at our voter. In a number of cases, white voters stop black voters from reaching polls by physically blocking them or usage of threats of violence to prevent black voters from voting. An example of this is Medgar Evers, who after returning home in World War II from Mississippi, quote, "All we wanted to be was ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would." In this case, however, our voter was lucky and proceeds to the building trying not to draw attention. As our voter approaches, they are struck with the realization they forgot where they left their poll tax receipt. The poll tax was one of the most prevalent ways of stopping black Americans throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Poll taxes took a form in various ways to keep blacks from voting, but generally a few factors contributed that we'll be looking at. To starters, we need to look at the cost. For example, the average black sharecropper in 1911 got $205.48. This has been given by the Lee J. Alston of Indiana University, Bloomington. This is an income, by the way, not expenses. Not counting expenses, sorry. Keep in mind that sharecroppers had a significant debts to the cropland system. In Texas, according to the Bullock exam, the poll tax was, in 1902, set in $1.50. Thus, the poll tax would have been asking the average black sharecropper for 0.73% of the income of a black sharecropper, and black sharecroppers thus being a large portion of the population. Quote, in 1910, nearly 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and 3/4 of them in rural areas. United States History of the Arts and Archives. Additionally, it is worth it to note that poor whites also received a lower wage had in their favor the grandfather clause, which stated if your grandfather voted in 1967 or 1980, by some cases, that you didn't have to pay the poll tax, otherwise known as you pretty much could vote. Obviously, in 1867, right after the Civil War, or before the Civil War in 1860, the black participation in voting was, well, minimal. Eventually, the poll tax was ended with the 21st Amendment. Fortune, however, smiles upon our voter in this case, and thus the voter finds their poll receipt in the pocket of their jacket. The voter then approaches the white voting official, who is clearly not amused at the appearance of a black voter. The white official would then take out of a cupboard a paper. This was a literacy test. In 1910, quote the National Geographic of Education Statistics, the population of blacks that were illiterate over the age of 14 was 30.5% of the black population. Additionally, the officiant could also use their own discretion, which means that even if you seemingly passed the test as a black voter, you could still be denied the right to vote. Our voter, however, has encountered this test before, has studied rigorously, and by some miracle passes a literacy test. Now, the voter marks on the ballot their vote and leaves. The effects of voter suppression in the South had ultimately destroyed black voting power during the Jim Crow era. Blacks did not register or attempt to vote, as voting for them was more than less infeasible. After this point, our black voter also has to worry about being purged from voter rolls or attacked by white supremacist groups. In conclusion, voting was simply not an option.